No, wait.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Stop, stop, stop. Yay, Descartes. I in my 1305 class, I'm talking about Descartes right now. So this is kind of fun. Watching him talk about Descartes while I'm talking about Descartes. Um, and students keep saying things. Why are we reading all this old shit that's hundreds of years old? And I say, well, actually, we're reading a book now that is still very important, and he's spending a lot of pages talking about Descartes. So anyway, nice coincidence. I don't know. This uncharacteristically understandable for me. Um,
I had some, I guess, something to, if you
go
want me
for
to,
it.
sure, get the machinery started,
Do it.
so to speak. Hi everybody. I like this reading. This one was pretty cool. I like anybody anytime somebody's beating up on Descartes, because there's a big part of me that wants to get in there in his corner. Hey, he's still got some stuff to say. Come on. I like underdogs, and weirdly, Descartes went from being the top dog to now everybody's kind of punching bag, and so I like it. It's fun, but I also I really there were certain elements of his criticism of Descartes that I really strongly agree with. I'm really compelled. I was really compelled by the arguments he was making. I thought he was putting them in a very clear way. But I do have a question, and it's about a passage right near the end when he's talking about desevering. So just to I think I know the trajectory of the reading this time. It was this thing on what is the being of the world, and here's Descartes' answer, and here's why that loses touch with the order of being that we're talking about. Res extends as substance, that sort of thing. Then he talks about passing over, and passing over being an effect of Dasein's essential being, the region of closeness. But okay, oh, by the way, there's a fire alarm going off while I'm, oops, there it is. Oh, there it goes. Okay, excuse that. But at the end, he starts talking about spatiality. And in the discussion of spatiality, he says some things that were kind of confusing to me. I'll say that. Because, and maybe it's part of, I had two big points at which I was confused. And maybe one of them might be explainable to attributable to the shoddy workmanship of Macquarie and Robinson. That's totally possible. So hold your questions until all right. So there is 146, which again might be just a translation problem, but I'm going to okay. So he says that there is this this tendency. Dasein is this on page 139 of the Macquarie and Robinson, which is the Heidegger 105. Heidegger 105 at the beginning of section 23, the spatiality of being in the world. In that section, the spatiality of being in the world, Heidegger's talking about desevering as making farness vanish and bringing something close. And this is on Macquarie and Robinson again. This is made explicit on page 139. In the top paragraph. And there's a specific, I think that's still Heidegger 105. So there's this specific sentence that kind of threw me off. I think it's, as he's talking about desevering, there it is, yes. After, on the Macquarie and Robinson on page 140, as that paragraph continues, as that paragraph, or approximately and for the most part, desevering is a circumspective blah, onto 140, which is still, I think, 105 of Heidegger. He says, bring something close by in the sense of procuring it, putting it in readiness, having it to hand, but certain ways in which entities are discovered in a purely cognitive manner also have the character of bringing them close. And then this is in italics. This is a whole sentence in italics. In Dasein, there lies an essential tendency towards closeness. And all the ways in which we speed things up as we are more or less compelled, blah, 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 blah. This, I have a big question about his idea of closeness here, and it might, I fear that my questions might be answered by this other thing we read called Country Path Conversations by Heidegger, where he talks about closeness and farness. But I'm basically questioning, I'm kind of objecting almost to this statement. In Dasein, there lies an essential tendency towards closeness. And I don't remember exactly where it is, but I have some examples, even from his analogies and examples that I think make me think counter to this statement. Um, and I would point to one, do you remember the glasses analogy where he says that glasses are remote? Glasses as a vehicle for, as an equipment for seeing are remote. They're so remote that they're sometimes impossible to find, which was a cute joke. I thought that was cute. That's funny. But that's precisely the thing. The proximity of the glasses and the equipmental context within which they are interpolated, the depth and the whole, like the complete swallowing up of this object into my mode of being, into my body, it disappears. It becomes remote. And wouldn't that indicate that there's sort of like I don't know, maybe there's some sort of point. There's some sort of point at which closeness starts turning into naturally a remoteness. And another example, he talks about the radio as the conquest of remoteness. In fact, on that same paragraph, all the ways in which we speed things up, as we are more or less compelled to do today, push us on towards the conquest of remoteness. With the radio, for example, Dasein so expanded its everyday environment that has accomplished a deseverance of the world, a deseverance which, in its meaning for Dasein, cannot yet be visualized. Which is pretty like whoa, like he's talking about some shit that would like have crazy random, like me being like an internet guy now. It's like I'm reading this, like that was a crazy moment, for his, he's like Nostradamus. But I would say that pointing at something like the question concerning technology, there's at least one moment in Heidegger where he's saying that, or at least that spirit in Heidegger would lead me to believe that the expansion of radio and television and internet and so on, and of these technological processes by which we conquer remoteness, we do not embody an essential tendency towards closeness. Basically, I think you know what I'm saying? I think if closeness tends toward remoteness at its extreme, wouldn't that thus mean that any tendency toward closeness would thus be a tendency toward remoteness eventually, just further down the line, logically, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it feels like he's using closeness in two different senses there to me. It feels like in the first sense, he means something like noticing, where things that you have the availability of recognizing as an object and treating as an object, those things have a closeness to you. And it's sometimes correlated with actual distance, sometimes not, because the glasses example, right? And the radio example too. I mean, like the things I'm hearing are far away from me. But the second one feels like distance to me. It feels like I don't know, he would want to say something like, it's a little bit more difficult. I don't know to I don't know that something about we have a tendency towards closeness in the sense that like I don't know. Does that make some sort of sense that like there's I don't know two different senses there, that one is maybe something about what's available to you and the other one actually has to do with the distance?
I think so I was having problems paying attention earlier. Maybe I was listening to Nick Jonas, but um not really. I was but um so I can at least envision how those two senses, in the way that he's talking about closeness and the at hand, the being at hand of equipment or useful things. There's a kind of closeness there that he's talking about. And then there's this question about technology and the quest to have this de-distancing or deseverance of distance as part of the essential tendency towards closeness. Yeah, I think that so is that at least the two senses involved? There would be there at least the two cases because yeah.
And
Yeah, okay, sorry. Okay, so with the at least with the technology thing, I think there is definitely calling it an essential tendency towards closeness and then kind of connecting it with this historical development of technology. There's definitely some complications I think that could arise there, and that it seems to have a kind of almost teleological kind of view of history almost in there. Um, maybe apocalyptic or eschatological or something. But aside from that, I think at least what he's talking about with something like radio, where it brings this deseverance of things that are distant into kind of nearness where I can, incorporate it. I'm involved with it at that point. Uh, I think that's kind of it's roughly the same thing as something like having a hammer at hand, which is not a present at hand spatial distance, but it's about a certain availability to of its usefulness for me. Um, but yeah, I think at least I can see how the technology in a normal way is just another part of the kind of the other aspect of technology, the more kind of manual aspect. I don't know if that is actually kind of answering especially Hunter's question or not though. So whatever.
I wasn't sure if Hunter was there. Was there did you find, or did it seem to be that there was a contradiction here somewhere, or that I kind of missed what, if you were saying that he contradicted himself in some way, or he was inconsistent or something?
Yeah. I guess that's well. Here's what I'm asking. I get. I'm not. Yes. I would say that on one hand, I'm saying that it seems like an inconsistency in an idea, which is this idea of closeness and farness. The second thing is that I think from empirical, like from my observation, it seems that, oh my God, and here it is. The fire alarm is back. Yep, there it is. Sorry about that. So my point is cut short.
Well, I mean,
I thought
I
you
would
were having
think
an
that,
epiphany. Like, oh my God, there it is. And I'm like listening and oh, it's the fire alarm.
I mean, I'm not sure where the contradiction is, because I would think that, like my glasses, when I'm looking for them in the morning and I can't find them, they're, they're distant in a way that they're not when I'm wearing them, because I don't even notice them, right? Like most of the time, like you suggesting, I don't even notice I have them on. And so they're far away in the sense that they just don't even appear in my attention, right? They're just not even there really. And yet when I don't have them and I'm looking for them, they are there for me in a way that is much more noticeable. So I mean, I don't, maybe I'm missing the point. I don't see a contradiction there, at least in that kind of a situation. It's just that, like you said, or even with technology, that there, so I don't even know if this is a good example, but during the Vietnam War, which most of you are too young to remember, but, I guess maybe you could say during the Iraq War or any of those, it was televised. I don't know anything about Marshall McLuhan, but it was televised, and it came into people's living rooms in a way that World War I and World War II didn't. And so, you know, in World War I and World War II, you had reporters, and some of them, I mean, it was very hard to know whether what the reporters were telling you was real or not, or true or not. And it had this distance to it because that was happening way over there, and these people were reporting to you. But in the Vietnam War, I mean, they say, you know, it was the first televised war, and it was right there in your living room. You see these young American men getting shot and killed, and it brought that situation near to the American public in a way that had never happened before. And it was quite shocking. And it really did change the American people's sense of what was happening, because it brought it near in a way that it never really had before. So I don't know if that's a good example or not, but yeah, maybe with the Palestinian thing now.
I guess okay. Now that nothing's on fire, I can try to explain. My the issue came both from my empirical just observation of history and from the examples that are brought forward here by Heidegger. So he makes a claim in italics here. In Dasein, there lies an essential tendency towards closeness. What I'm saying is that you are correct in that the glasses seem to they become remote from you because they're so close. They're too close to even recognize as being there. They fade away. They fade into the background. What I'm saying is, if that's like the extreme end of closeness, if things can get so close that they go far away, then I would imagine a tendency to closeness and greater closeness would eventually, at its extreme, kind of turn into a tendency toward remoteness. Eventually, a lot of other things might become more remote. And I have some other examples from my empirical observation and from like Marx. You know, I mean, I don't know what Heidegger thinks of Marx. I mean, I know when I say that tongue in cheek. I do know, but I'm saying that at least Marx and Heidegger can generally agree on a certain point, which is on not on the makeup or the form of alienation, but on the general experience of it. And as a result of industrialization, not as a result of, but part of the process of industrialization and enlightenment, certain form of alienation, and it's a problem. And I agree. I think that the expansion of industrial technology and the reproduction of art and things like that produce circumstances that we would call alienated or alienating, be it from the product of your labor or from whatever, an authentic experience, being alienated from an authentic experience, whatever. So what I'm saying is both in what I can tell from the historical development of technology and our various successes in the conquest of remoteness, it seems to generate remoteness. And it seems in this case, with the glasses as an example, and machinery, I guess in general, like a car or anything else that kind of fades your body. Yeah, and I'm chill with alienation. Let me be clear, Chase. I'm chill with alienation too. All right, I need certain stuff to be alienated, very much so. I don't want to be unalienated from everything, like my toilet and my lights and my video games. I want it to be like Nevitt was describing. I want it to be magical. I want there to be a magical computer box that I hit the button and then TV and beautiful images and whatever that stuff and sounds can blast into me, and I don't have to think about it at all.
But is that closeness or alienation?
Or remote. See, okay, now here's my thing. I don't know. And here's my caveat. Here's the upshot of all this. If the two are in a tandem, if we are going to say that remoteness at its extreme is a sort of closeness and closeness at its extreme is sort of remoteness, then there's a dialectical relationship at hand. That being said, there is no reference to a dialectic at any point. And I don't see a dialectic anywhere else in this thinking. So it's not a dialectical process. It's not a dialectical methodology. At least by my account. I mean, by my reading. I don't know. Maybe I'm fucking completely wrong. I look like fucking
You had
nice
to bring
bit.
up dialectic. I don't. You could not bring up
Right.
dialectic.
Well, yeah, and I mean, well, the two things at their extreme tending into each other, that's a possibility.
Yes, yes,
And if
yes.
and if Heidegger is saying that there is like a dialectical relationship between the two, then I'm chill with that. But he doesn't seem to be. He's saying there's something else, this sort of I don't know, this thing that's not a dialectic, but it's these two things blending into each other, their extremes like a Mobius strip, but it's and you see what I'm saying? That's my problem. That's my question. This is my question.
I mean, I think at this point I need to get you a t-shirt with Mobius strip on it. Like that should just be a band you create. Like I love that term. But he like and I'm reading from the Stanbaugh edition, like on the Stanbaugh edition in this first section, and forgive me, I don't have my headset on, so if I need to speak louder, I will. Um, he starts talking about like mathematical disciplines and procedures, and then in the next section he's attacking Cartesian dualism. It's almost like he's saying that the subject object distance, like there's an object and a perceiver, and we can boil this down to how the object and the perceiver work through this. I think he's saying that's fundamentally flawed. Like I think he's saying that there's a totality in the human experience in this world, in that there's certain like procedures to how we interact with it, but it can't be boiled down axiomatically or structurally. And that procedure may be dialectical, like you said. It could be something different that he's building. I'm curious, but he seems to want to bring everything up into totality rather than separating it between object and observer, and then combine that with this new system of not only that, but how we experience and form ourselves in our scope of existence. Like there's this procedure of nearness and farness, like an existential focus that we have at this given moment. So it's not subject and object, it's a totality of how we interact with these things and what we particularly focus on, and then how we express how that like expresses our humanness or what makes us Dasein in that particular circumstance, moment, history, environment, whatever. Like I think it almost seems like in a way he's saying that causality, if you try to search for it, if you try to go down the route of subject object, if you're following the Cartesian tradition, you're going to get in this infinite circle of trying to find the next thing that caused causality. Like you're just going to boil it all down and it's never going to end. You're never going to find, who you are. You're just going to be in this infinite quest of, are my glasses near or far? But there's a certain procedure, there's a certain aspect of us that we kind of embody in practice. And I think that's what he's trying to get at.
I see. So what you're saying then, Joseph, and this might kind of it's not that things become close by the Dasein's proximity. Dasein's naturally flip things ontologically into close things, but that we have a tendency towards closeness and endeavoring to closeness. Like you're saying, it's like a procedure. He's describing a procedure whereby Daseins operate with whatever effect, be it closeness, like a hammer, or like our glasses, where they get so close that they disappear. I guess the hammer does too. But we endeavor. It's like an endeavoring. It's a striving. It's maybe like a statement of a general tendency of like a striving, and not necessarily a description of an event where, or like a historical like account of like human beings tend, or not human beings, Daseins tend to make things close more and more and more and expand closeness and closeness and closeness alone, but rather that closeness is the name of a sort of endeavor that has ramifications down the line that are close and far and everything in between, or I guess, right?
Yeah, I mean that's how I took it, a totality with an emphasis on procedure.
But it's that language when you say it becomes so close that it disappears that makes me think you're equivocating, because like it becomes so close spatially that it disappears in my experience. And those are two, I mean, it seems like they're using those words in different ways. Like spatially close then becomes experientially absent.
Bro, I mean the glasses I could maybe like replace I could replace because the glasses are physically very close. But I guess all the examples I can think of are like a car. You're also kind of physically you're strapped in. You're and like a video game controller or an instrument that a musician is playing or something. Like something that becomes just a part of the experience and of their body and not a tool.
Dare I say, this would potentially have been an ideal point for Heidegger to introduce something about sex, closeness, so on and so forth. Objects used in sex that disappear in the process of having sex. Condoms, if you're not familiar, gentlemen.
Dildos.
Dildos, so on and so forth. But then again, that would require Heidegger to talk about sex and eating, I think. But yeah, that's what hey, put me on the cross, Your Honor. I was in your head. This looks like an ideal spot for Heidegger to talk about sex. Interesting that he did not.
So yeah, all I'm saying
that's better than glasses. I think it's a better example.
Heidegger only goes raw. Just saying.
He doesn't do any of that. He doesn't fuck around.
Hannah said what? Hannah said what?
Yeah. All I'm saying is I'm in a conundrum because all the examples I can come up with for the closeness I'm describing, like the glasses and this thing, those are all the things I can come up with. The Dasein is proximally, physically very close, and so I agree. It's like all the examples I'm coming up with are ones where physical proximity is like a necessary element. But that's not like I'm not trying to aim at that. I'm trying to talk about the
a love letter. A love letter. No one ever wrote Heidegger love letters, I guess. I think that would be a letter, an object which makes the love of another feel close. I mean, would that not be similar, or are we off base at the point?
I think he would just consider that as a particular ontic example of something, but he wouldn't probably see that as kind of fundamentally its own thing. That'd be my guess, at least. But both this and this, I mean, the idea of a kind of philosophical analysis of sexuality, and then also what was talked about earlier in terms of kind of these extensions of the body as this kind of incorporated aspect. That's also very Marshall McLuhan, but a lot of this stuff is extended in Merleau-Ponty, who kind of takes a lot of Heidegger and then does kind of actually extend it to more of an analysis of the body as kind of that becomes the existential structure that is of Dasein, that's for Heidegger. It becomes instead kind of this body schema for Merleau-Ponty. And he also has a whole chapter on sexuality and the phenomenology of perception. Although I hardly remember anything about that chapter, except I remember that he says that it's an existential dimension, which means that it could potentially apply to anything, but in a kind of indeterminate way. It's the only thing I remember from that chapter. But yeah.
I was also thinking to go back to last week, and it's a small note. I think that what Hunter was waxing on earlier about there being a striving sounds to be that it's like, again, I'm not saying they're one-to-one, but it seems to be towards closeness, and it's kind of like very similar language from Fichte in some places. about making the world accord and reason with. It brings into closeness things for which accord with its purpose of action, and it flees from others, so on and so forth. Not exact good terms, but that's striving, drive, going on there. Just as another mark. But to bring it from last week, I think I was completely wrong. There's stuff that's in there you could potentially go, but I don't think it's necessarily correct. So I am reprimanded for last week. 3 days in county jail, upholding court, so on and so forth. But there was a section here in the reading from this week, where he's talking about Kant. I think it's 110, section below there. I kind of wanted to take Heidegger here, like a rooster, and take Beiser as another rooster, and then throw them into a pit together and make them fight, because it seemed to be like, for Heidegger to be correct, Beiser had to be wrong. I don't have the capacity to describe that anymore, but I think that is my philosophical methodology, is turning these two figures into roosters and then making them fight here, because I definitely think that in particular that the idea that Kant, the subjective accusation against Kant is something that Beiser fights against. And so I'm calling for the council, anyone here who can comment further. Did they see something similar, that this interpretation of Kant relies upon a certain kind of subjectivist accusation toward Kant for it to be correct?
I'm gonna. It's been a while since I looked at Beiser, and I want to say this is one of those elements where Beiser would even say Kant was not successful in staving off the threat of creeping subjectivism. And I want to say what Heidegger's doing here is a very kind of Kantian approach to fix the problem. And again, Kant, I want to say, I think if Heidegger were in the room right now, he would say, up until this point, Kant has given the best description of spatiality, but it's too much rooted in the subject. And so this is me kind of tweaking this, and representing this Kantian doctrine of the a priori formal nature of space and time, but taking away the heavy emphasis on the subject as such.
Hey, Eric, for those of us in the group that aren't very familiar with Kant, can you do a brief recap of a priori and post a priori, just for those of us who are not?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, what a good rule of thumb is a priori would be prior to experience, and then posteriori would be, after experience, or more to the point, presupposing experience. So, and a lot of what Heidegger's doing here in Being and Time is reaching for the a priori, right? That which was always already a condition for the possibility of, and whatever follows, right, will be a priori with regard to what follows.
I notice he puts a priori in quotation marks often, Heidegger, at least in the Stambaugh translation, which I take to, well, at least I've been assuming that he realizes his sense of the term is not identical to Kant's. And even when he uses words like transcendental, I'm not sure he means exactly the same thing as Kant. So like you said, because for Kant, so like space and time are the forms of intuition. They have to, so, to try to help answer Joseph's questions, for Kant, space and time are not anything that ever appear in experience, but they are conditions for the possibility of experience. So my experience can only be in space and time, but space and time they have to, in a sense, already be there. Space and time has to be already in place in some sense, simply in order for me to have any kind of experience at all. And so they're a priori in that sense, that space and time, they're necessary conditions for having any kind of empirical experience. And so that's why they're a priori. They just have to be there already present. But then, so then Eric is, I think, drawing the similarity between Heidegger's use of always already and this Kantian notion of a priori kind of has to already be there simply in order for you to have experience. But Kant has an analysis which requires a transcendental subject in order for this to work out. And I think the transcendental subject is the subject that never appears in experience. And it is a subject that is required for there to be this kind of experience, but it never appears within experience. So it's like the ground of consciousness. Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but I think it seems to me Heidegger is trying to account for those kinds of a priori structures without having to, he might say, resort to transcendental subjectivity. So if you remember, like in Schopenhauer, when we're doing Schopenhauer, there was this transcendental subjectivity. Maybe I shouldn't say subject, but transcendental subjectivity. There was this pure subjectivity that was a condition for a condition for possible empirical experience. And I think it seems to me Heidegger's trying to account for these features of experience that Kant and Schopenhauer would identify as a priori necessary for experience, but without having to posit a transcendental subject.
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah, on that note, like towards the end, can y'all hear me okay? My mic's weird. Tell me if I get out, but towards the end of like Heidegger 111, I don't know if y'all read this part already, but he says, wait, where is it? Sorry, now I'm missing it. Oh, here it is. Okay. Because Dasein is spatial in the way described, space shows itself as a priori. This term does not mean something like belonging beforehand to an initially worldless subject which spins a space out of itself. When I read that part, I thought he was criticizing Kant there. Like he's saying like that version of a priori is like, I don't know, this more abstract thing. Here, a priori means the previousness of encountering space as region in the actual encountering of things at hand in the surrounding world. Like that part to me seems like he's trying to say like Kant's onto something, but like it needs to be even less abstract and more like just the notion of a priori is like me in the world already, this existential thing that he's taken in from Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and stuff into the project.
Yeah, it feels like he's kind of taking issue with the causality there too. I don't know. I was trying to find it in the Macquarie translation, but I could not. But you said that, and I like the phrasing, like it spins out of subjectivity or something like that, right? And that kind of feels like he's characterizing Kant as saying something like, raw experience comes in and then there's some processing that happens or something, and then it gets formatted into this, spatial, temporal experience. And Heidegger's like, no, like, let's not say that there's a causal relation there. Let's instead say that like there already is a world there.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. Like he seems to almost be suggesting that causality is in a way a priori.
Yeah. Like what kind of causality are you thinking about there?
That when we are looking for a subject object and finding the initial object and the perceiver and what conditions there are prior to experience, that's an infinite recursion, that we're always going to be boiling it down trying to find the next thing after another, like when there's a mathematical principle or there's a different procedure for that, it's that procedure that produces these concepts and results. Whereas I think he's saying there's a totality of the human experience when we engage with the world where even causality can be considered a priori. It's like you have an experience with something and it's kind of going to have a triggered events with other items, tools, nearness, farness, whatever it is, but you won't be able to boil it down to one particular event. So I'm wondering if he is suggesting that a component of our perception of the world is causality.
Just to be clear, that's part of the Kantian system. In Kant, causality is a priori. Also, I wanted.
Oh, it is? I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah, and that was him kind of refuting Hume. A big part of that project. But I wanted to say earlier, I have to find the section again, but the part where he's talking about a worldless ego, I think I read that as his primary target was Descartes, and it doesn't land as squarely on Kant as it does on Descartes. If it lands on Kant, it's only because Kant is, philosophically a couple generations downstream from Descartes and still working with but again, the way from what I see Heidegger's perspective here is that Descartes messed it all up in a lot of ways, and Kant gave us the most promising kind of fix, although this was only partial because he was limited in what he saw. He was working on different problems. So, anyway, I do think it does somewhat land. A worldless ego does somewhat land on Kant, but the way it was phrased, it seems to be more squarely targeting Descartes.
Yeah, so I think a major target here with that line is Husserl, who said that there's a transcendental ego that constitutes experience that can bracket out the world. So he says, I mean, Husserl doesn't really say much of anything explicitly, but as close as you can get for Husserl to say something explicitly, he says that there's a constituting subject that is worldless, that that's your a priori kind of rendition of what he takes kind of from Kant, Husserl, and puts it into his own kind of phenomenology. So I think he's kind of going after, I think Heidegger's going after this whole kind of tradition that could maybe, to a certain extent, it kind of starts with Parmenides. Another sense, it kind of starts with Plato, Aristotle, especially as ontological. But really, what he's getting at specifically here with the worldless subject is, I think, indeed, it's Descartes to a large degree. And then he's saying that there's a continuity from Descartes' subject that is disconnected from the world, that doesn't have the world as a kind of necessary character of its being. And there's a continuity there with, skipping some people, Kant, and then from Kant to Husserl. And that's kind of the philosophical lineage tradition that he's trying to destroy. And I think that's what he's getting at. But at the same time, like you said, the destruction of ontology and the tradition doesn't mean a kind of complete destruction. So he wants to still have this a priori thing going on. He just wants to kind of really transform exactly what a priori means. And same thing with the transcendental. I think he still, like Kant, I think he still sees a priori and transcendental as pretty similar, except once again, they've changed quite a bit. So that it's kind of hard to, make these equivalent comparisons because, okay, so transcendental, it's about the conditions of possible experience. But for Heidegger, he doesn't really use experience as kind of what he's talking about as conditions of possibility. Instead, he's talking more about existence in this phenomenological aspect. Uh, so, yeah, he wants to take that basic structure of thinking in terms of an a priori, a previous, what are the conditions of possibility for these things? And then he's just simply changing exactly what those conditions are, what the a priori is, what the transcendental is. And I think so kind of going back to the stuff that Hunter was talking about with um closeness and remoteness and whatnot. So I think Heidegger would probably say something like the a priori, the kind of conditioning ground of these things is this essential tendency towards closeness, or closeness as this capacity to bring things into a region of for our use and for us to be embedded in the world and interact with it and all that good stuff. And then there's deficient modes then of these existential structures. So then that kind of remoteness would be a deficient mode of those things. So I think this is also kind of something you can understand with the a priori kind of way of thinking of it. And this is kind of, instead of doing a sort of dialectical thing, I think instead he's thinking of it in terms of there's these conditions, these a priori conditions, and then there's deficient modes of them. And that explains kind of this inner differentiation that's going on. At least that's what it seems like to me.
I think he's doing an interesting thing with proprioception. Did you even think about proprioception? And as I guess, like, as going into this section, if I were to guess on where we're at in the text, we're like 112, 111 area. I think we're solidly on that. I'm only saying that because I'm just trying to set a base, a beat. And I was just thinking that we talking about like left hand and right handedness for directionality. And I mean, kind of the thing is like it's like one I was screaming like, what about proprioception as like a more general way of thinking about place? Because I thought that seemed to be pretty. That I don't know. It seems like I was screaming in my head. Proprioception, like what's going on here? I know Merleau-Ponty does a lot of proprioception, but that's how I was thinking about this closeness stuff. I was kind of like, why are we talking about proprioception? And then moreover, how proprioception can get all screwed up, man. What does that do for the so-called a priority of what's going on here? I mean,
Deficient mode.
Just this right there.
Yeah, so the only way I can have the screw up is by the fact that I have the kind of underlying condition. So the fact that I have this orientation is what conditions the possibility that it can be disoriented. And likewise with the closeness thing. So the condition is closeness, and by the fact that I have this closeness, that conditions the possibility that then remoteness enters into the equation.
Well, but wouldn't it be, because I mean, that makes sense. There's a part in the standby where he like makes a note. I don't know. I probably won't be able to find it. Where he's talking about like, he says de-distancing is more precise than nearing, which makes me think the proprioception or whatever would almost be the inverse. Like we're fundamentally distant, and that is, coloring our perception such that we're seeking nearness. But unless I'm misunderstanding what you guys are talking about, because I'm very tired.
Well, if I might interject, I'm willing to entertain that, like you're saying, like Matthew, the picture that you're drawing, and like the idea of the deficient mode that Chase that you kind of offered. Here's a quibble with that. Here's a thing, I guess. I feel that I don't know. I guess I have a question about that. And it's if okay, I wrote it down as a note on my phone so that I wouldn't forget. If it's a deficient mode, right? This tendency towards nearness that then brings about remoteness, like we're saying. And you're saying it's not a dialectic. It's a deficient mode. Well, if it's a deficient mode, that's producing what appears to be this sort of inversing contrary thing or contradictory thing. If it's a deficient mode, then it is not this flip-flopping between extremes is not then a feature of those things. In this case, closeness and farness. It's not a feature of those things. It's an affect of a deficient mode. But this sounds counter to a point that Heidegger makes on page 141 of the Macri and Robinson page. It's either the bottom of 106 of the Heidegger or top of 107 in the Heidegger. There's a small paragraph that for me says it starts with when one is oriented beforehand towards nature and objectively measured distance of things. There's a small paragraph that starts like that at either the top of Heidegger 107 or the bottom of Heidegger 106 on the Macri and Robinson page 141. But so what I'm saying is this idea that it's a deficient mode and not a feature of the thing, closeness and farness, it seems totally crazy to me, because in this paragraph, the very last sentence in italics again, I really like these italicized sentences. They're easy for my brain to grasp. I like it when they highlight the important stuff. I can't keep many ideas in my brain. But he says here, the circumspective dissevering of Dasein's everydayness reveals the being in itself of the true world, of that entity which Dasein as something existing is already alongside, right? And in fact, I'll go let's read it in reverse. One sentence prior. This subjectivity perhaps uncovers the reality of the world at its most real. It has nothing to do with subjective arbitrariness or subjectivistic ways of taking entity, which in itself is otherwise. Okay, so you see the problem that's coming up. He's saying that insights on Dasein reveal insights on the true world, which Dasein is a part of and lives alongside of. Insights into Dasein reveal insights into the world which Dasein is alongside of and a part of. The circumspective dissevering of Dasein's everydayness reveals the being in itself of the true world, of that entity which Dasein as something existing is already alongside. That is a point that Hegel would adamantly agree with. Hegel would say, substance is subject. Insights into the nature of the subject reveal insights into the nature of the world of which that subject is a part. Heck yeah, big thumbs up. But then that would mean downstream, logically, that the flip-flopping which the subject experiences as a result of this nearness and farness stuff would not just be an affect of a deficient mode. It would rather be an element of those things, the nearness and the farness themselves. And that holds for me. That's consistent for me. But in this case, you see the thing? Heidegger breaks the chain. Heidegger doesn't go as far, it seems, with this idea that he's putting here on 107. He has this, and I'm with him on this idea. I totally agree. But then the nearness and farness thing being a deficient mode, rather than an element of nearness and farness themselves, that trips me up, is all I'm saying. So, and there's definitely, I'm not saying this is like some knockdown contradiction, he's being inconsistent, objection. I don't see how he's making that move. That's all I'm saying. I don't get how he's doing it.
I was just gonna ask a really crude question. So James, if by all means, it was gonna be a question along the lines of uh let's see. Okay. Hegel. We've had the conversation in the past, Hunter, I think, and asked a question about is Hegel constipated or is he constantly shitting? And I think that I have this thing is that for Hegel, it seems to be that Hegel's trying to not be. I think we've come to the idea that Hegel's constantly shitting, is I think the lot of thing that you and I came to at one time, which means that he's trying to that I think the thing there is he starts out full. I don't know. Part of me wonders, like, I get the sense that like Heidegger starts constipated, or no, he starts empty and then he's making himself full, in some sense. That the world he's like an empty vessel. The world's getting full. But yeah, I was just gonna ask a question. Where do you think Heidegger falls on the line of that? Is he like at the start full, and then we go out in the world and we find particulars? Is it the other way around? Because I was reading this section and I was like, that's what I was leaning toward. Because I also was seeing the Hegel stuff, but I want to see like how is the world different in the two of them. You can put it in the chat so that James can ask us actually erudite question. But I just wanted to get it out there. I want to know: do you think he's constipated, or is he living it all out? In the chat, please. In the chat, please. In the chat.
So to try to give a translation of what you're saying, could you maybe say that constipation is something like presuppositions? So if you come in with presuppositions, whether it's an always already of some type, we have a pre-ontological understanding of being. That's something that Heidegger carries with him. And there's lots of philosophers do this in one way or another. Would that be something like constipation, and then kind of explicating their philosophy would then be shitting, would be explaining it from those presuppositions? Or am I
No, I think that's what
by stretching
exactly where I'm at. I think he's constipated and then he's trying to get it all out in the system. And I my sense is Heidegger, that's Heidegger. And Hegel, part of me it sometimes thinks Hegel is doing the same thing, and the next time I think about it, I think that he's emaciated and he just can't get full enough. He wants to eat the whole world. And so that's exactly the sense I was getting from Heidegger reading this passage.
I wanted to ask how people here would put deseverance in their own, like how people here would define deseverance in their own words.
So I think deseverance would be, so it's kind of getting close. It's about this closeness or nearness. And as in an existential sense, not a present at hand sense of spatial proximity of things, but this way that things can become close for you, as in ready to hand availability, than a context of references and all that good stuff. I think that's kind of what he's getting at. The fact that things can come to be close for us, that is not in a present occurrence sense.
I was thinking of it in terms of integrating things into my world, something like that. Integrating and world there, I'm not sure, like which world, I don't know, but integrating into my world to where they're part of my context, my context of world that I have sort of more or less immediate access to. And that was why I was suggesting that maybe like the or television is maybe a helpful example, because that's clearly not something like my glasses that are sitting on my face or a tool, but that if a literally or spatially remote situation becomes part of the meaning of what constitutes meaning and value in this, I don't want to use the word value because he hates on that word, but that becomes part of the context of my world, then it's Stoneball uses the word de-distanced. It's made close in the sense that it's now integrated, and it becomes part of the way I experience myself and the way I experience the world. And so like I've been hearing news reports, like especially Palestinian Americans. I mean, given that I don't have any direct relationship to Palestine, it's not as intense. But there are Palestinian Americans for whom Palestine is like this real part of their world. And so that's the kind of way I'm thinking about it, is it's the ability to integrate into my the everyday experience of my world.
Yeah, like for me, when I approach this, like I'll think about it like, and James, you can probably relate to this because James, you play guitar, and so it's like I think about like so when you first started playing guitar, it's like this distant thing that like you're holding it there and you're clumsy with it, and it's all like shit, and you just can't get a grip on it, like literally, kind of, you don't know how to like do your hands, and then over time, it becomes you become equipped to it enough that it's a part of your world, um, and so you're de-distanced. Now, maybe I'm wrong in how I interpret that, but that's kind of how I thought of it. Um, but I think it would also apply to like stuff like Nevitt's talking about too, like just our world and and the objects we encounter, are objects, like, and this is what makes it different, I think, than Descartes' view, is like the objects aren't just these discrete objects out there. It's that the objects are like they're made coherent in terms of the background of meaning, and the in the kind of gestalt or whatever between, of which to such that you their meaning is being disclosed to you by the way you're relating to them. So like the way someone who plays guitar relates to a guitar is different, than the meaning of than the way someone who doesn't understand how to play good. Like if you're a guitar player and you're watching someone play a song, you're looking at the chord progressions they're using and stuff like that. And there's a whole world of experience that one who isn't acquainted with that is not, being involved in, I guess. But maybe that's how I interpret it.
I'll just say in a passing comment, I wrote something about that in the chat up there about that notion of de-distancing with news, and Hunter raised a bunch of complications having to do with Beauregard and that stuff. So I don't really know how to answer all that.
Hunter, by the way, to rejoin what I was saying earlier, I think his kind of horror, the conquest of the remoteness, is connected. I think that's definitely at Hegel in some extent here to bring up the theme again. But I'm really stuck on that page, man.
Yeah. I'm not trying to belabor anything, but yeah, I guess I'm still a little bit puzzled on account of this this move that Heidegger makes in order to join together what seemed to be, to me, two very different things, two very different ideas. One being something that I recognize in Hegel, and one being this sort of operational deficient mode thing, which I don't think that they're totally incommensurable, but I guess that's just an open question. But again, I don't want to belabor anything, so I figured maybe I'd just do something a little bit easier. Maybe because this is the one that I was saying could be attributed to just Macri and Robinson's translation, foozling it, so to speak, at some point. This is on Heidegger page bottom of 111 and or top of Heidegger page 112. It's right above one on the Macri and Robinson. It's on page 146 of the Macri and Robinson edition. So 111 and 112 of the Heidegger. There's a paragraph that starts, "Space is not in the subject, nor is the world in space." I found this odd, and maybe people who don't like Macri and Robinson already for various reasons will get really inflamed by this paragraph as I read it.
I bracketed that entire paragraph. Thank you for bringing that up.
Let's here. I'm going to read it, and just in case anybody who hasn't read it, who already has kind of a bad taste in their mouth for Macri and Robinson, let's see. "Space is not in the subject, nor is the world in space. Space is rather in the world, insofar as space has been disclosed by that being in the world which is constituted for Dasein. Space is not to be found in the subject, nor does the subject observe the world as if that world were in space. But the subject," and then in parentheses, Dasein, the subject, Dasein that is, "if well understood ontologically, is spatial. And because Dasein is spatial in the way we have described, space shows itself as a priori. This term does not mean anything like previously belonging to a subject, which is proximally still worldless and which emits a space of itself. Here, a priori means previousness which space has been encountered as a region wherever the ready to hand is encountered environmentally." We already kind of touched on that, the a priori thing. But the rest of that paragraph is what was interesting to me, because space is not in the subject. That's odd, because one, I think of space as sort of this all-encompassing idea, sort of like matter. And so it's hard to imagine space as not, unless he's sort of using space in like a particular way. And I guess he's differentiating, he's just kind of laying out some vocab. And in my mind, I guess space is this sort of this non-sensuous sensuous thing, this non-sensuous super sensuous thing. But the further thing is the subject, Dasein. And I thought we were all about that not being the case, about the subject, but the Dasein not being a subject. Those are my two things. Anyway, go ahead, anybody.
Well, for the I have the Stambog translation, and to me, maybe it's more coherent than your translation, maybe not. But so for mine, it goes like at least those first two sentences: "Space is neither in the subject, nor is the world in space. Rather, space is, quote, in the world, since the being in the world constitutive for Dasein has disclosed space." So what I take that to mean is like I think he's trying to say like space is not subjective, like there's a kind, but he doesn't want to say it's objective either, because he's trying to get out of this like subject object divide thing. But I think he's saying like, so space is in the world since the being in the world constitutive for Dasein has disclosed space. So like Dasein is, part of being in the world, that kind of long hyphenated thing where there's a relationship between the subject or the Dasein and the bigger gestalt of the world. So like from the point of view of the quote unquote subject, what is space is in relation to the other kind of beings that are beings in the world for Dasein. Like, so like I'm situated here, and this thing over here is like this other object is related to me through some kind of coherence of like a network of meanings and whatnot that are constellated through being in the world, that big gestalt of how it all like fits together. And I think I just interpret that as him trying to kind of juxtapose his framing of spatiality from Descartes, where it's this more atomized, or like like a billiard table, like it's all just one big like meaningless kind of universe of things occupying space. It's like I think he's trying to put us in the point of view of the being in the world within space. I don't know if that makes sense. That's how I interpret it.
And I think being in the world as primarily ontological, not about consciousness. And I think, I think that, in terms of phenomenology, it seems to me the big shift from Husserl to Heidegger is the shift from consciousness, or from questions about what consciousness is and does, to questions about being. And so I think, for Heidegger, being in the world is not prime. So like I think, I'm not sure, but I think Heidegger is going to say, or would say, that subjectivity is something that sort of emerges from being in the world, rather than being something that emerges from a kind of subjectivity. And so if ontology is the sort of ground level of Dasein, then spatiality is not something about it's not something about consciousness. It's not something about the subject. It is an ontological feature of being in the world. And so spatiality is essentially Dasein, not because Dasein is a subject that has to experience consciousness of space, but because Dasein it is embeddedness in a world, this ontological embeddedness. And what that embeddedness that Dasein is, has these relations that you can abstract from and talk about space in this sort of Cartesian way. But the primary mode that Dasein experiences spatiality is not in this sort of abstract mathematical Cartesian notion of space. It's being embedded in a world of ontological structures. And so that's why in terms of the a priori, I mean, that's why I think it's a priori in a bit of a different sense from, Kant and Descartes and Hume. It's a priori because it is a feature of what it means to be in the world. So it's already there in that embeddedness. And so it's a priori in that sense. It's not a priori in something like the structures of a transcendental subjectivity that make, it possible for consciousness to have this kind of experience. I don't know if that's any help, but that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much all that. I think what he's getting at mainly is that the kind of differentiation that he's been harping on for this whole chapter 3 with in spatiality terms, or I think one thing that's helpful is he doesn't kind of fully cater to this, is spatiality would be something like this existential spatiality. And then there's space that would be the kind of Cartesian president hand thing. And he's saying, yeah, space is not in the subject, nor is the world in space. So from that perspective and that concept of space. But then in terms of that ontological existential embeddedness of in, that's what he's saying, that space is in the world in that sense, and also in Dasein in that sense, because the world is its own kind of spatiality. And then also for Dasein is its spatiality, which it's not just spatiality, but that's definitely one of its constitutive characteristics is spatiality for both the world and Dasein. And I think that's what he's getting at there. And then he's got this whole kind of the same kind of critique of the tradition of philosophy that is also there, at least in far as I don't, if we want to interpret Kant as saying something like space is in the subject, or at least there is some kind of subjective constitution of space, even though I think, like Eric was saying, the idea of a kind of subject behind these a priori things for Kant is pretty complex. One, because there's kind of a transcendental aspect of subjectivity, and there's also an empirical aspect of it, kind of split in the subject. Um, but that's kind of so beside the point. But so yeah, I think that's what's going on there. And also, so it kind of pissed me off that he was using subject here, even though I see why he's doing it based off, he's kind of continuing this thread he started, I think, a few pages ago, where he's saying, there's a part that Hunter read previously, but it was about, okay, there's the subject or whatnot is not, is okay, so he's talking about the examples of de-distancing, and then ask the question, are these merely or kind of estimations of things, like half an hour instead of 30 minutes, or a stone's throw away instead of 12 meters or whatever. He's getting at the idea that, yeah, there's a kind of, that's what existential spatiality I think really is something like that. The kind of sense that you understand things is where you say something like, yeah, that's close. You're not talking about something, oh, really? Well, what actual distance is it? I can't know if it's close unless I, get out my measuring tape and do that. Saying like, no, that's stupid. And so this estimation he's talking about, and then ask the question, is this just merely subjective? And then that's when he brings in this thing of, okay, well, if you want to call Dasein a subject, then you have to understand then that this subject is actually what would give you this access then to this reality as objective reality that you think underpins things. It's the opposite. Instead, it's the subject, which is not about an arbitrary, just, oh, yeah, I feel like thinking that closeness is over there or this. Instead, he's saying that no, that's the a priori kind of previous conditioning of it is with Dasein. If you want to interpret Dasein as subject in this sense of the sense counter to the merely subjective arbitrariness that he's contrasting with it, then we can say that. And then he kind of continues that use of it, which is already kind of complex and confusing, and then repeats it here, but also in this connection with all the talk about Kant and Descartes. It's all kind of mixed together there. So complex, but I think I've got something of a sense of what he's kind of getting at. I don't know.
I have a general question. Maybe someone could, at least in the Stomba translation, this word inner-worldly keeps coming up, and I think I have a vague sense of its meaning. But if someone wanted to give me like a precise definition, more or less, of when he's saying inner-worldly, what he means by that.
Could you cite a place in the German edition so we could see what how McQuarrie translates it?
Yeah, I mean, just a random example that so like before 1 113. So this is somewhere I think still on 112 of Heidegger. I'll just read the question at hand, or the sentence where it comes up. He says, well, the places and the totality of places of useful things at hand, which are circumspectly oriented, are reduced to a multiplicity of positions for random things. The spatiality of inner worldly things at hand thus loses its character of relevance.
Yeah, so that interworldly aspect, that's the okay, so for Dasein, we have being in the world as, and there's a being in that is a part of our Dasein's being. And interworldly refers to the beings or entities that constitute mainly equipment, or what he'll calls like beings or entities we encounter within the world. So that's kind of the way that equipment or useful things is encountered within the world, is that's what that interworldly is. So it's talking about, therefore, this, the way he spells it out in the later sections of that part A of chapter 3, with there's the whole context of references and signification, these equipmental context, or let's see, well, you're using the Stambog, right? So yeah, it's the context of useful things that give things their relevance. That is going to be this interworldly aspect, the way that things belong to the world when they're ready to hand.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense.
What's the exact spot you're talking from? You're talking about, like, you said 113, it's between 113 and 112.
Yeah, like kind of towards the, yeah, like the paragraph. It's in the
Right
paragraph.
before 113.
Yeah, before 113.
So, and I think, okay, so
Maybe
yeah,
halfway through.
I think our translations are different.
Oh, okay. Yeah, at least 113 of the Heidegger. So
Yeah, that's what I'm saying from the Heidegger. Because I'm looking at, I'm not sure I'm seeing that. Someone else can, because it's a paragraph before he gets into like res extensa and whatnot, correct?
yeah, the paragraph
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, because he doesn't even use in our translation. I think in the weird one, the one that no one likes, the M one, it doesn't use inner worldly beings. I don't think.
Yeah, it's in the old translation doesn't use those exact terms. I think it just says something like within the world, or I can't remember exactly, but the interworldly is that specific term is in the new translation.
So in the at least if I'm reading the Stamball right, the Heidegger 113 breaks a paragraph. And so there's a partial paragraph at the bottom of Heidegger 113. And the full paragraph right before that in the Stamball uses that term. So in this, maybe Matthew already read this, but the paragraph before that, before the last full paragraph on Heidegger 113, where space is discovered non-circumspectly just by looking at the regions of the surrounding world get neutralized, pure dimensions, blah, blah, blah. And then he says this, so it's the third sentence in the Stambach translation, the spatiality of inner worldly things at hand loses the character of relevance. So that's one place. I mean, she uses that term all over the place, but that's one place where that term shows up. The spatiality of inner worldly things.
Yeah, that was the one I was pointing to.
Yeah, we're with the spatiality of what is ready to hand within the world loses its involvement character, and so does the ready to hand. I think that's the difference in translation, right?
Within
In
the
a way,
world,
I
yeah.
like your translation more because your translation, what you just read, is kind of what Chase
Yeah.
defined inner world. It's almost clearer than interworldly.
Hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like, I mean, and this sounds like what Chase was saying. Interworldly things is basically ready to hand things, right? Yeah.
Well, and it seems like it's pointing out. I guess I can see why they're choosing interworldly because it seems like they're trying to emphasize it's ready to hand, and then keeping in mind that for it to be ready to hand, it has to be in a world already, kind of, and like bring awareness to that.
Which really, that's a decent summary of this whole chapter in a way. His whole kind of thesis about the world is essentially that the world is not some secondary thing that we discover after we've already, come to grips with the cogito or something like that. Um, it's that it's always already there, encountered.
Yeah. I mean, he starts off this section asking, does Descartes ever find the phenomenon of world? And, his answer seems to be no. And if I was to ask Descartes, what do you mean by world? My guess is Descartes would say something like, it's just the collection of things in the world. I mean, it's just the total collection of things. Or, in Heidegger's terms, it's like the collection of ready to hand things, including my body. That's the world. And I think Heidegger is saying, no, the world is not just the collection of ready to hand things. The world is a phenomena in itself. It's our phenomenon. And that Descartes just misses the worldliness of the world. He misses world as, what's the word I'm looking for? World qua phenomenon.
Yeah. So when he asked that question of does Descartes encounter the phenomenon of the world, and I think he had some other question in there too. And then I like how he has the no. He immediately answers the no, the exclamation point, which, I mean, aside from Nietzsche, you don't see many exclamation points in philosophy usually. So I thought that was kind of neat.
So the very final paragraph, the way I'm interpreting that, but I mean, I might be wrong in interpreting it this way. He says okay, I'm just going to read it real quick. The primary ontological character of the being of interworldly beings is not found in the phenomenon of space, either as unique or as one among others. Still less does space constitute the phenomenon of world. Space can only be understood by going back to the world. Space does not become accessible only by depriving the surrounding world of its worldliness. But that's, I guess, to me, it strikes me as he's trying to say, like, okay, space does not become accessible only by depriving the surrounding world of its worldliness. So, like, when I'm reading him, there's a part of me that wants to interpret what he's saying in general as, like, Descartes got it wrong because he was depriving the world of its worldliness, right? And thus we're left with this kind of space, this sort of existentiality less, like no existential space. But he's saying he's saying space does not become accessible only by depriving the surrounding world of its worldliness. Spatiality can be discovered in general only on the basis of world in such a way that space, after all, also constitutes the world in accordance with the essential spatiality of Dasein. Okay, I know I'm reading the whole thing, but I guess I'm wondering if what he's saying there is that not only is like that the error of Descartes is not merely that he's kind of emptying the world of its existentiality or something, but that he's accidentally um, telling, like, he's coding that we should look at the world in terms of its spatiality primarily, and that he can only do that because spatiality is a part of our design. And I hope that maybe I just waste everyone's time, but I feel like he's saying something very subtle there that I'm trying to unpack. So
Would a second translation help for you? Because like I we different translations again.
yeah,
on that.
maybe so.
All right, so in the phenomenon of space, the primary ontological character of the being of entities within the world is not to be found either as unique or as one among others. Still less does space constitute the phenomenon of the world, unless we go back to the world, space cannot be conceived. That's an interesting sentence. Space becomes accessible only if the environment is deprived of its worldhood, and spatiality is not discoverable at all except on the basis of the world. Indeed, space is still one of the things that is constitutive for the world, just as Dasein's own spatiality is essential to its basic state of being in the world. That's an entirely different paragraph, almost. Also, I kind of need Heidegger to have like a paragraph or two after he actually ends, because when I start seeing the bottom of the text, my brain starts like rushing and I quit actually like reading what I'm reading. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, oh fuck, the end's here finally, and then like I just like don't remember any of it. So I need like clown buffer space here for me to read, so that I can actually pay attention to what's going on here.
I think we've talked about this, so sorry to rehash it. But just when you were reading that, it became very relevant to what I was thinking about. And that's that it seems like the relationship he's trying to note is that space is related to the world, right? So that's one relation. And then spatiality is related to Dasein. And I think someone was talking about space versus spatiality earlier. I don't know. Did someone sum that up again? Like so we have the first relation, space, world, second, spatiality, Dasein. How do those things interact?
Yeah, I was making that. I can't remember where I think I might have gotten that from the previous, so he kind of gave a preview of this section on spatiality in a previous section, about what's it called, like being, where he first goes into this distinction between being in the world, in as a preposition. What does that mean in an existential sense? And then insideness as this in the present at hand sense, where that's talking about the kind of something being included in the vacuum, the container of something else. Or he gives a decent description of that aspect of what I'm calling, okay, so spatiality, the way that I was using it, would be that existential sense, yeah. And of the same way that being in the world is an in that existential spatial sense. And then space, you can put maybe a capital S there, maybe. That would be the present at hand, the other sense, the Cartesian sense, the scientific sense. Yeah. What was it? Oh yeah, I think the thing with the relation of spatiality, world, and Dasein, I think this is, you get this cluster of concepts that are all strangely kind of synonymous, but not exactly. I think almost every at least decent philosopher has this aspect, and we've stumbled upon Heidegger's kind of the cluster of vaguely synonymous concepts that are also slightly different in subtle ways, but that's kind of what constitutes his ideas, his concepts. I think yeah, we've stumbled upon it.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, I mean, like I was thinking, trying to think of different examples, and one might be of like an existential inness, like that expression, like you could take the man out of Texas, but you can't take Texas out of the man. It's like Texas is in the person in some sense that is not literal, but it's also saying something significant. Not that that's exclusively what Heidegger means by inness, but it seems like that notion of like being in a world, like in Texas, there's something about Texas that's more than just the physical borders of the state. There's like this world that you're in, and you can go somewhere else and still be, or at least that world's in you or whatever.
I thought it was you can take the thug out the ghetto, but not the ghetto out the thug. But Texas works well too.
Well, I was thinking of, Heidegger likes hammers and workshops. So, if I am not, I don't do this, but my son and my wife work and they've basically built a wood shop, turned our garage into a wood shop. And, when they're doing stuff there, I mean, they're doing stuff in space, but what they're doing is they're working with these tools in this environment, and so they're running wood through the saw, and then they're running it through this machine and through that machine. And so they're spatially oriented, and they're in this world of woodworking, which has all these present at hand tools that they're not really thinking about as tools. They're just, again, almost extensions of their body as they're shaping this wood, but they're in this world. And so there's a spatiality there because there are these relations. Again, like he says, I am farther from the hammer than I mean, he doesn't, anyway, like he would say, I am farther from the hammer than I am from the saw. And so there's these spatial relations, but that's what I think of as spatiality. It's this sort of where things are in relation to my project in this world, whereas Cartesian space is, you step back and you look and you think, okay, there's a room, it has so many dimensions, and I could take a tape measure and measure the distance between these objects and calculate, this and that. So in space, I'm not really embedded in that world or related to it. I've extracted myself from that embeddedness, and I'm just looking at space as like a big box. Like I put in that note, sort of a space-time box. You've got this big space-time box, and there are things in it, and you can measure them and analyze them and so on. Again, in a kind of scientific way, but that's different from the spatiality that you experience when you're engaged in some kind of activity.
Something and maybe this is something I'm constantly in the back of my mind thinking about is, and I'm trying, anyway, is Heidegger's what like similarities and dissimilarities to pragmatism. And I brought this before, but because there's an element that obviously like does remind me a lot of pragmatism, in that it's like about just like it's like with that, I mean, just the significance and the salience of things maybe are, I mean, there's something that seems similar to like it's not necessarily about getting at the objective truth of like the size of the room or whatever, but more like an appropriate approximation. But I mean, obviously he's doing something different, but this would be an interesting area to, I feel like I read someone somewhere say that Heidegger had encountered pragmatism, and though he didn't 100% agree with it, he found it interesting and stuff. So this is not, maybe if anyone else knows about any relationship between him and pragmatism, I'd be interested. But otherwise, maybe that's a cul-de-sac of the conversation to bring up.
I think that Dreyfus actually talks about that in the intro of that commentary, that we were talking about last time.
Yeah. So I think one way to approach that is kind of what Eric was talking about in a previous session, where it was about Kant prioritizing the practical over the theoretical, which I think that's a pretty fair way to talk about, especially what Heidegger's doing. But even then, that's kind of a tendency of phenomenology in general. Maybe Husserl is still a pretty theoretical, but I think even he is still interested in a kind of unlocking the practical aspect of the world. But so another thing that when it comes to that sort of the pragmatic, practical emphasis, so a ton of these points that Heidegger makes about this are very, very close to Henri Bergson, and he was buddies with William James, and like they're bros. They hung out with each other and probably did nitrous together, guessing, so they could understand Hegel. So that's the only way, according to William James. I'm not saying that. Well, I mean, it's true, of course, but yeah. Which probably explains maybe Hunter's activities. Possibly.
I don't know anybody who's
Remind the
into
court that we are on record. We are on record still. Do we need to have a back? Do we need to come to? Do we need to approach the bench?
No, I'll just say this. I don't know any Hegelian doesn't have a proclivity for anesthetic experiences. All right. You know, except for Zizek, but he's like a monster, subhuman creature. You know, and he admits that. And he knows that. He's proud of that. He's the only one who can, you know, really power through that stuff with that. Hey, you know, he said in an interview, "I've never smoked a cigarette or drank a drop of alcohol." And the guy was like, "Really?" And said, "Yes, I'm a monster." He was like really excited of how weird he was. He was like, ah. Anyway, that's it.
Hunter, have you seen the Zizek impersonator guy? I think he was at South by Southwest or something like that. But it's a pretty good impression.
The guy on TikTok?
I
Whatever,
don't,
yeah.
I have TikTok, but that's not what I watch on it.
But yeah, well, but you're right. Well, yeah, and just to add some sort of productive intervention into my into this little divergent conversation, I would say yes. I actually on that same set of pages that I was all haranguing in the Heidegger 106 and 107, when he's talking about a good walk or a stone's throw, I mean, like he just explicitly said it's a duration. You know, it's really, I mean, without saying his name, it was very much like, okay, I just thought about the sugar cube in the glass. You know, that's the illustration that Bergson, or the sugar cube in the cup of tea, as like his primary illustration, or one of the leading illustrations that Bergson used in Creative Evolution, I believe, to illustrate duration as like, but like I don't know how far would. Here's a question, I guess. Would Heidegger go as far as Bergson goes with his argument on duration? That it's like the way we conceive of time. The way I saw Bergson is going pretty far and saying like the conception of time as being these discrete elements like seconds and minutes is just, I mean, it's functional, it's useful, but it's wholly inaccurate to experience and to reality. And so describing our lives as taking place over a course of like temporal units is kind of silly. It's incorrect. It's improper. It's inappropriate. It's an inappropriate application of a certain metric. Whereas our lives are not kind of the parts of our lives that are important, I guess, besides I guess the length of it, like the actual like facticity, like our maybe 80 some odd years on existence on Earth. Aside from that, the way we think about and describe and find meaning in our lives is not according to that scale of time. And I guess I guess is Heidegger going there too and saying like, yeah, time. So he's going that way with space. He did that with space, and I guess this is his move of that with time is saying like, yeah, he's trying to take the present at hand, make it ready at hand. I guess kind of like how, and so in a sense, Bergson is kind of doing that, taking time from present at hand to ready at hand. I guess, or the other way around. That fucks with me. Sorry for my French, but that I get those flip flop, present and ready, and present and hand, and at hand and to hand. Is there a difference? I've seen both. Whatever. That's all right. Present at hand, present to hand, whatever.
I think at least okay, so it's present at hand in the old translation, and then ready to hand, and then the German is vorhanden. So the for is the vor, is that's the prefix that's kind of like it's given the to in the English translation, and then oh wait, no, I got it mixed up. Yeah, never mind. But anyways, the point about Bergson, I think you're definitely right in that. Yeah, you can see what's going on with Bergson is something very, very much similar to what's going on with Heidegger. Although Heidegger he'll do something very similar. Okay, so I have to say first that I'm not totally sure exactly about Heidegger's full theory of time. We have to read the rest of the book, I guess, until I guess I really know. And even that's kind of hopeful. But I know that he does have a differentiation between primordial time and I think world time or ordinary time, something like that. And that seems pretty similar to also what Bergson talks about with time, where duration is kind of real primordial time, and then there's the spatialization of time, which the intellect does in order to kind of objectively understand the world in a pragmatic fashion. And that kind of folds out into both a kind of ready to hand way of approaching time in a spatial manner, and then also a present at hand aspect of spatializing time in order to be understood in that kind of metric, that kind of Cartesian metric. But Heidegger was a anti-Semitic Nazi and didn't want to credit Bergson with that. That's at least one theory. But I don't know. He also never mentions the name Spinoza in this entire book, which is also interesting. So, and he was a Nazi. So I don't know. It's Heidegger's fault for making me think about whether this is the case or not. But yeah, he says that. Okay, so he talks about Bergson's concept of duration explicitly in this book, and it's in a footnote on the very last page in a section on Hegel. Yeah. So I think it's the very last section. I may be wrong about this, or very close to it. He's got this thing about Hegel's concept of time, and then he has this long footnote about Bergson's notion of duration. And so he thinks that Bergson is just kind of reversing some terms of Aristotle, and so that he's still keeping too much to the traditional idea of time in Aristotle by changing quantity to quality. But it's basically wrong. Heidegger was just wrong about this. That's the short version of it, but they have a very interesting relationship. Maybe one day I'll write an essay about this, if I'm capable of writing anything still. I don't know. I think graduate school has made it almost impossible. maybe I could interpret that in a Heideggerian way, but I'm too tired for that. And it's 9:03, which doesn't mean we have to end immediately, but yeah.
I think we're on the boost. Yeah, we're on the boost.
You should do a Deleuzian Guattarian analysis of graduate school experience.
Oh, yeah. So so Deleuze wrote an essay on the new systems of control society. I think that would basically be it. He's kind of advancing Foucault's idea of disciplinary societies, which is already very similar. I mean, there's reading Discipline and Punish Foucault. There are pages where I was like, oh my God, I'm living this. So like regimentation of your life according to like a schedule and things like that to maximize your efficiency. This is like, oh my God, this is fuck. Like, oh no, I said a bad word. Oh, it's okay.